Australia's Victoria state reported a record rise in new cases and deaths today, 725 new cases and 15 deaths in the past 24 hours. On top of a 6-week night curfew in Melbourne, large parts of the city's retail and manufacturing sectors will be shut down.
Construction firms must also radically reduce the number of works on site, while production at mid-works statewide will be cut by a third. Essential services like banks, supermarkets, pharmacies and petrol stations will remain open.
Our Australia correspondent Jonathan Pearlman joins us from Sydney to tell us more. Jonathan, how did Victoria get into this situation in the first place compared to where you're at, New South Wales, which is of course Australia's most populous state, which recorded just 12 new cases yesterday?
Yes, so Victoria had all but wiped out their coronavirus outbreak, but it came back around June after failures in the hotel quarantine system. Some security guards at hotels were not protecting themselves properly. They caught the virus and then spread it. Subsequently, the government introduced a lockdown, and firstly, people were not completely adhering to the lockdown rules. So people were going to work when they were sick. Particularly, this involved casual workers who were scared of losing their job or missing out on money. So there were holes in the system, including in the aged care system and in the casual workforce. And as a result of that, people were not obeying the rules properly, and now we have a situation where the Victorian numbers are far in excess of what they were the first time round in March.
Not only are major industries in Melbourne shut, 500 military personnel will be deployed to enforce the isolation orders. Plus, there are fines of nearly 5,000 Australian dollars for anyone breaching these orders. How are Victorians taking to these tighter measures, Jonathan?
I think people are accepting them, but there's a level of depression, there's a level of anxiety, and there's a level of shock. I think going into it a second time round, going into a stricter lockdown a second time round is difficult for a lot of people, having felt that they were over it the first time. There's a level of shock at looking at some of the busiest streets in Melbourne. This is Australia's second largest city. It's a global city. And these are some of the busiest streets in Melbourne that are just completely empty during these nighttime curfews. So it's a big change for the city. It's something that the city hasn't experienced before. But I think now there's a general acceptance that there's no other way to avoid further outbreak except to comply with these measures.
Well, Jonathan, in light of what's happening in Victoria, how is the rest of the country reacting in order to avoid outbreaks in other states?
Yes, so other states have really begun shutting their borders. Some had already shut them, but states like New South Wales, the most populous state, which includes the city of Sydney, are now requiring all Victorians to undergo quarantine for 14 days, or anyone coming from Victoria will need to undergo quarantine. I mean, that's a really significant development that's occurred today. Sydney and Melbourne are really the two biggest cities and comprise a large part of the Australian population. Before this pandemic, it was one of the busiest flight routes in the world. And now flights are at a standstill effectively, and anyone coming in will now have to undergo quarantine like international passengers will. And on top of that, other states like Queensland are barring people from New South Wales, from Victoria. So suddenly all these state borders are going up. Again, it's a strange development for Australia because state borders were really kind of an irrelevancy before this.
Jonathan, do stay safe down under, and thank you so much for coming on the show. That was the Australia correspondent for the Straits Times, Jonathan Pearlman.